I want you to try a quick exercise with me. Just close your eyes for a second and picture the quintessential classic American image of Oklahoma. Just bring it to mind.
I bet I know exactly what you're seeing.
Right. Chances are you're picturing the 1889 land run, like covered wagons racing across this dusty, wide-open plain.
People aggressively staking claims in the dirt.
Exactly. The rugged frontier spirit conquering the wild. Or, let's be honest, maybe you're just hearing the soaring strings of the Broadway musical, with the wind sweeping down the plain.
Yeah, that is definitely the story we are all told.
It is. It's this highly curated image that's just been burned into the American consciousness. But today, for this deep dive, we're going to take that script, turn it completely upside down, and look at the actual handwriting on the back.
Because to really understand Oklahoma, you have to look underneath that very specific, heavily manufactured mythology.
Which brings us to our mission today. We are looking at the real foundational story of Oklahoma. We've opened up a massive stack of historical sources, archaeological records, treaty documents, first-hand accounts.
And we're using them to track the incredibly complex, often tragic, but, fiercely resilient experiences of the Native American tribes in this region.
Right. And our main focus, the thread we are really going to pull on today, is how the Indian Removal Act didn't just, move people from point A to point B. It executed one of the most radical, calculated, and forced demographic shifts in human history.
It's an immense topic. I mean, to truly grasp the scale of that forced migration, we cannot start in the 1830s. We really have to look at the land before the removal.
So set the stage for us.
Well, we have to understand what was already there. What was thriving and evolving long before the United States government decided to treat the entire region like an empty warehouse for human beings.
Let's start right there, actually, because there's this pervasive myth that Oklahoma was just this, empty waiting room.
Oh, absolutely. The empty land narrative.
Yeah. I think a lot of people imagine it was just a vacant, desolate lot out west, sitting there in silence, waiting for displaced Eastern tribes to be moved in. But looking at the archaeological records in our sources, that is just fundamentally untrue.
It's completely false. People have been living in what is now Oklahoma since at least the last ice age.
Wait, the last ice age?
Yeah, we are talking about deep ancient history that completely shatters that whole narrative. Archaeologists have found Paleo-Indian sites that force us to rethink the entire timeline.
So what are we looking at in the sources?
Take the Burnham site in Woods County, for example. The sources classify this as a pre-Clovis site.
Okay, pre-Clovis. What does that actually mean in terms of years?
In archaeological terms, it means we are looking at evidence of human habitation dating back before 11,000 years ago.
Hang on, 11,000 years. Just to put that in perspective for you listening, that is millennia before the pyramids were built in Egypt.
Right.
That is an almost unfathomable amount of time. How do we even know they were there? What survived?
It really comes down to what they left behind in the soil. And it gets even more fascinating when you look at Harper County, where researchers uncovered the Cooper bison skull.
A bison skull.
Not just a fossil, it's the earliest known painted object in North America.
Wow. Are you serious? The earliest in all of North America?
Yeah. It dates back between 10,200 and 10,900 radiocarbon years. Someone applied a red zigzag pattern, which was likely representing lightning, to the skull, probably for some kind of hunting ritual.
That is incredible. So you have thousands of years of human habitation, complex adaptation, and artistic culture thriving in this landscape long before European contact.
Exactly. And it doesn't stay a landscape of just nomadic hunters either. As we move forward in the timeline provided by our sources, the societies become incredibly complex.
Right. The sources get into the agricultural societies.
Yeah.
We need to talk about the Caddoan Mississippian culture.
Yes. Between 800 and 1450 AD, eastern Oklahoma was the western edge of this massive, dynamic cultural and trade network.
And they were building permanent, sophisticated urban centers.
They absolutely were. The Spiro Mounds, located on the Arkansas River, are the premier example of this. And when we say mounds, we aren't talking about small piles of dirt.
No, these are massive architectural achievements, right?
Massive earthworks. There were ceremonial platform mounds, burial mounds, all meticulously arranged around these vast open plazas.
And those plazas were kept intentionally clean for major public and religious events, according to the text.
Right. This was a highly structured, hierarchical society with a dense population. It wasn't just a few people camping by the river.
The sources specifically mention elite tombs, too, like the Great Mortuary at Spiro. What exactly did archaeologists find in there that points to a hierarchy?
They found immense wealth and symbols of authority. The tombs were literally filled with exotic grave offerings.
Like what kind of offerings?
Well, they found copper from the Great Lakes region, conch shells all the way from the Gulf of Mexico, intricately carved effigy pipes.
Oh, wow. So they're trading across half the continent.
Exactly. The sheer concentration of these rare goods in specific tombs tells us that certain families or lineages held immense political and religious power.
They controlled a vast trade network connecting the Mississippian world of the East with the traditions of the Great Plains.
Spot on. It was a major geopolitical hub.
That paints such a different picture. It wasn't an empty waiting room at all. It was a flourishing economic hub.
And if we look at central and western Oklahoma during this pre-removal era, you have the Plains tribes.
Right, the Wichita people.
Yes, the Wichitas were living on the terraces above the Washita and South Canadian rivers. Our sources describe them living in these large, rectangular thatched houses.
And they were farmers, right? Not just hunters.
Both, actually. They were farming corn, beans, squash, and tobacco while also going out and hunting bison. And they were trading all the way into what is now Texas and New Mexico.
So they were a deeply established agricultural society.
And they shared the broader region with others, too. You had the Tonkawa people in north-central Oklahoma and the Plains Apache, who migrated into the southern plains between 1300 and 1500 AD.
So you've got multiple distinct nations coexisting.
Right. They all coexisted, traded, and, sometimes fought with the Wichita.
Then, as we move into the 18th century, the demographic tapestry undergoes a massive shift, and this time it's purely due to technology and migration.
Which is such a fascinating turning point.
You're talking about the introduction of the horse, right?
Yes, the horse completely changes the game. The Comanche acquire horses and migrate down into the southern plains from the Great Basin.
And that completely revolutionizes their mobility.
Their mobility, their hunting efficiency, and definitely their military power. Around the same time, the Kiowa migrate down from the Rocky Mountains.
And then by 1796, the Osage arrive in northeastern Oklahoma, pushing down from the Missouri area.
Exactly. So the geopolitical map is constantly shifting, but it is incredibly full.
I'm trying to visualize this for everyone listening. Imagine looking at a masterfully painted, incredibly dense Renaissance canvas.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. You have overlapping trade routes, ancient burial grounds, shifting political alliances, huge agricultural hubs. And then the United States government walks up, assumes the canvas is completely blank, and just starts slapping a cheap coat of primer over the whole thing so they can paint whatever they want.
That analogy perfectly captures the sheer arrogance of the federal policy at the time.
Because they just completely ignored what was already there?
Completely. When the United States later designated this exact area as Indian territory, they were superimposing tens of thousands of displaced Eastern Native Americans directly on top of that complex Renaissance canvas.
Just pretending the original painting didn't exist.
Right. They ignored the established dynamic travel boundaries. They ignored the centuries-old trade routes.
And understanding this pre-existing world is so crucial because it reveals the fundamental flaw in the U.S. strategy.
Exactly. The land wasn't empty. It was a flourishing, deeply populated geopolitical ecosystem.
Which begs a massive question. How do we actually get from this thriving hub at the Spiro Mounds to the Indian Removal Act?
The causal chain is really something.
Yeah, what is the chain of events that turns a populated sovereign region into a designated holding zone for a foreign government?
The main mechanism driving everything was land hunger, plain and simple. And it was facilitated by incredibly cynical legal maneuvering.
Walk us through that maneuvering.
Well, the United States was expanding its population rapidly, and individual states desperately wanted the fertile land that Native American tribes legally held within their state borders.
And the first major domino in our sources is the 1802 Georgia Compact, right?
Yes. The 1802 Georgia Compact is really the blueprint.
Break that down for us. What was the actual mechanism of that compact?
So in 1802, the state of Georgia claimed a huge swath of Western territory, essentially what is now Alabama and Mississippi.
Okay, a massive amount of land.
Huge. And the federal government wanted that land for the nation, so they made a deal. Georgia agreed to give up its claims to those Western lands.
But there is a catch.
A huge catch. In exchange, the federal government promised to extinguish all Native American land titles within the state borders of Georgia. The exact phrasing was, as soon as it could be done peaceably and on reasonable terms.
Wow. So Georgia essentially said, we will give you this massive Western territory, but your payment to us is figuring out a way to legally erase the Native Americans from our state.
That is exactly the mechanism. It was a transaction.
But the federal government immediately faced a logistical problem with that, didn't they?
They did, because if you legally extinguish their land titles and force them out of Georgia, where do you put them?
Right, the U.S. didn't have a designated place to send them yet.
Not yet. But that problem was conveniently solved just 1 year later, in 1803.
With the Louisiana Purchase.
Yes. Suddenly, the U.S. buys this massive expanse of land west of the Mississippi River from France.
And almost immediately, politicians looked at that newly acquired, largely unmapped western land and saw the solution to the promise they made to Georgia.
Exactly. The western lands of the Louisiana Purchase became the conceptual dumping ground for the government's removal policies.
I want to highlight a really telling detail from the sources here about how haphazardly the government was drawing lines on maps they frankly didn't understand.
Oh, this is a perfect example of the hubris of the era.
Right. Long before he was president, Andrew Jackson was involved in defining these new western borders, and he made a rather monumental geographic mistake.
The Andrew Jackson border anomaly?
Tell us about this, because it's wild.
So in 1820, Jackson was representing the U.S. government in negotiations with the Choctaw Nation. This resulted in the Treaty of Stand.
And the goal there was a land swap, basically.
Right. The goal was to give the Choctaw a piece of the new Western Territory in exchange for their eastern lands. So Jackson drew the boundaries on a map, but he literally did not know the geography well enough. He inadvertently ceded a massive portion of the Arkansas Territory to the Choctaw.
And why was that a problem?
Because that specific land was already being heavily settled by white American citizens.
Oh my God, he accidentally gave away land to the Choctaw that his own citizens were already living on just because he didn't know how to read the terrain?
Exactly, which naturally caused a massive uproar among the white settlers in Arkansas.
I can imagine. So what did the government do?
Well, in 1824, they had to go back to the Choctaw, admit the mistake, and renegotiate.
Awkward.
Very. The Choctaw actually agreed to shift their eastern boundary further west, but they made a very specific, almost petty stipulation to ensure there was no more confusion.
I love this part. What was the stipulation?
They demanded the new border start precisely 100 paces from the military garrison at Fort Smith.
That is incredible. A literal walking measurement.
Yes. So if you look at a map of the United States today, and you see that distinct, weird little bend in the modern border between Arkansas and Oklahoma,
that exists purely because Andrew Jackson didn't know his geography.
Yep, and the Choctaw demanded a walking measurement of 100 paces to set the boundary in stone. It's a permanent cartographic scar of a bureaucratic blunder.
That's fascinating. But that blunder was just the preamble, right?
Unfortunately, yes. Jackson's attitudes toward Native Americans didn't soften. They hardened significantly.
So when he becomes president of the United States, that early land-swapping strategy evolves into sweeping federal law.
In 1830, he signs the Indian Removal Act.
And this is the pivot point. We need to be very clear about what this act actually did, because the government's public-facing stance at the time was that this was a choice, right?
They definitely framed it as a voluntary exchange of lands.
But the sources show that the mechanics of this law created an absolutely impossible ultimatum.
The ultimatum was engineered to guarantee removal. It wasn't a real choice.
What were the actual options presented to the tribes?
The federal government said to the tribes east of the Mississippi, you can sign a treaty, give up your ancestral homelands, and move west to this newly defined Indian Territory.
Okay, that's option A.
Or, if you choose to stay, you must completely dissolve your tribal governments, give up your sovereignty, and become individual citizens of the states you currently live in.
Which sounds, to a modern ear, almost reasonable.
Yeah.
Until you understand what state law meant for a Native American in 1830.
Exactly. State laws in places like Georgia were aggressively, intentionally hostile.
In what ways?
Well, if they stayed and became state citizens, they were subject to laws that forbade them from testifying in court against a white person.
Oh, wow.
They were forbidden from owning certain property and essentially stripped of all civil rights.
So anyone could just come and steal their land and they couldn't even testify about it in court.
Precisely. It was a choice between exile or total subjugation.
This brings up what I find to be the most bitter, tragic irony in this entire history. Let's talk about the 5 civilized tribes.
Right. The Choctaw, Seminole, Creek, Cherokee, and Chickasaw.
Why exactly did white Americans call them that?
They received that moniker because, for decades, These specific nations had strategically adopted many aspects of European American culture.
As a survival mechanism, right?
Exactly. They believed that if they assimilated, the United States would respect their sovereignty and let them keep their land.
What did that assimilation look like in practice?
They developed highly advanced agriculture. They established centralized constitutional governments modeled after the U.S. They built schools.
The Cherokee famously developed their own written syllabary, right?
Yes, thanks to Sequoia. And they even published their own bilingual newspaper.
That's incredible adaptation.
It was. And tragically, some wealthy members of these tribes even owned large cotton plantations and participated in the enslavement of black people, completely mirroring the Southern white economy.
So they looked at the rules the U.S. government laid out for what constitutes a civilized society, and they played the game perfectly.
They mastered the game. But the historical insight here is crucial. Their assimilation offered absolutely zero protection.
Not at all.
In fact, it backfired spectacularly.
How so?
By developing their land, building roads, and proving how incredibly fertile and profitable their territory was, they made their land infinitely more desirable to white settlers and cotton speculators.
That is a stunning realization.
Yeah.
The narrative was always civilize and you can stay.
But the reality was, assimilation was actually the trigger for their removal.
Because the white settlers didn't want empty wilderness. They wanted the highly developed, profitable infrastructure the Native Americans had already built.
You've hit the core of the issue. When white expansion demanded their property, the federal government abandoned the assimilation rhetoric entirely.
You just threw it out the window.
Exactly. As our sources explicitly state, Oklahoma was chosen as the destination simply because it was, at the time, the only available location where the Indians would not be in the way of white expansion.
The goal was simply to push them past the edge of the map.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Let's get into how this actual displacement happened. Because I think if you ask the average person on the street about the Trail of Tears, they picture one single monolithic event.
One long line of people marching in the snow.
Exactly. But the sources make it very clear that the removal of the 5 civilized tribes was a multifaceted, prolonged, and chaotic campaign. Each nation experienced it differently.
Yeah, framing it as a single event diminishes the sheer scale of the logistical nightmare the government engineered. Let's look at the mechanics, starting with the Choctaw.
They were the first to face removal, right?
Yes, after signing the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830. Their removal began in the winter of 1831, and it was defined by catastrophic federal incompetence and corruption.
What happened?
The government contractors hired to provide food, blankets, and transportation frequently pocketed the money instead.
Oh my God. So people are marching into freezing winter storms without the supplies the government legally promised them.
Precisely. The freezing weather, combined with starvation and outbreaks of cholera, devastated the population.
That is horrific.
It was so brutal that a Choctaw leader, being interviewed by an Arkansas newspaper at the time, described the journey as a trail of tears and death.
Oh, wait. That is the actual historical origin of the phrase.
It is. Even though popular culture most heavily associates it with the Cherokee today, it originated with the Choctaw experience.
Wow. And then you have the Creek Nation who looked at the Choctaw experience and essentially said, we are not doing that.
Right. They entirely refused to relocate. The Creek tried to use the legal framework to save themselves.
How did they do that?
In 1832, they signed a treaty agreeing to open up a large portion of their land in the east to white settlers. But the crucial caveat was that the U.S. government legally promised to protect their remaining lands from encroachment.
I feel like I can guess how well the government kept that promise.
They completely abandoned it. Almost the moment the ink dried, massive waves of white squatters overran the remaining Creek lands.
And the government just let it happen.
They did absolutely nothing to intervene. Squatters were stealing property and violently harassing the population.
So the treaty was useless.
Completely. Eventually, starving and desperate, some Creek factions retaliated against the squatters.
Which is exactly what the government wanted.
Yes. The U.S. government used that retaliation as the excuse they needed. In 1837, the U.S. military moved in and forcibly evicted the Creek. There was no final removal treaty. It was a military deportation.
Which brings us to the Chickasaw. The way they handle this is fascinating, purely from a pragmatic standpoint.
Their approach was highly calculated.
Right, because they are watching the Choctaw freeze to death, they're watching the Creek get militarily crushed, and they realize the federal government's promises of protection are completely worthless.
Exactly. The Chickasaw leadership recognized the existential threat and took a different route. They signed a removal treaty in 1832, but rather than rely on corrupt federal contractors.
They did it themselves.
Yes, the Chickasaw essentially managed and funded their own removal.
How do you even do that?
They sold their eastern lands and used the capital to buy their own supplies, their own wagons, and they even negotiated to purchase a specific section of land in Indian Territory from the Choctaw.
So they essentially bought their way out of the worst of the suffering.
They moved early to avoid the absolute destitution that decimated the other tribes.
It's like having to pay out of your own pocket to fund your own unjust deportation just to ensure your family doesn't starve on the way.
It's a tragic pragmatism.
But then you look down at Florida, and the Seminole Nation takes the exact opposite approach that the Chickasaw. They decide to fight.
The Seminole Resistance is one of the most intense guerrilla conflicts in American history.
What sparked the actual fighting?
The U.S. government managed to get a small, completely unrepresentative group of Seminoles to sign a relocation treaty in 1833.
But the rest of the nation didn't agree to it.
Right. The vast majority of the Seminole population, along with the Black Seminoles, formerly enslaved people who had escaped and integrated into the tribe, rejected the treaty as entirely illegitimate.
And when the U.S. military tried to enforce it,
It sparked the Second and Third Seminole Wars.
and the government wasn't fighting on open plains either. They were fighting in the Florida swamps.
The Seminoles used the geography to their absolute advantage. They waged a bloody, incredibly expensive guerrilla war that lasted for years.
It had to be a nightmare for the U.S. military.
It was. They ambushed supply lines, disappeared into the Everglades, and completely frustrated the U.S. forces. The conflict cost the U.S. government millions of dollars and thousands of lives.
Did the U.S. ever actually win?
Not a total victory, no. The military eventually realized they could not root them all out. So, for the Seminoles who survived the wars, the U.S. government literally resorted to paying them cash bounties to board the ships and move west.
They had to bribe them to leave. That is wild.
Yeah, it really is.
Finally, we have to talk about the Cherokee. Their story might be the most famous, but the details in these sources are still shocking.
The Cherokee removal is a profound tragedy of broken faith.
Right, because in 1835, a minority faction of the Cherokee signs the Treaty of New Dakota, which gives the tribe 2 years to voluntarily move west. But when that deadline hits in 1838, there are still 16,000 Cherokee living on their land. Why didn't they leave?
Because they deeply believed in the American legal system.
Wait, really?
That's for everything.
Yes. The principal chief, John Ross, and the vast majority of the Cherokee people had formally protested the treaty. They had gathered tens of thousands of signatures proving the treaty was fraudulent.
So they took it to the government?
They believed that the U.S. Congress or the Supreme Court would look at the rule of law, see the fraud, and protect their property rights.
They thought the system would work the way it was written on paper.
But the system was rigged. President Martin Van Buren ignored the petitions entirely.
And he sent the military instead.
He sent 7,000 federal soldiers, commanded by General Winfield Scamp, to force them out. The military moved rapidly, pulling families out of their homes at bayonet point.
With no time to pack. Almost no time to gather food or winter clothing. They were forced into internment camps before being marched westward in what became the most infamous Trail of Tears.
And because of that rushed eviction,
Roughly 4,000 Cherokees, a quarter of their entire population, died on that march from exposure, disease, and starvation.
just staggering. And we have to make it clear for you listening, the removal policy didn't just stop at those 5 tribes. The sources list dozens of others over the following decade.
Whoa, absolutely. The Shawnee, the Delaware, the Kickapoo, the Miami, the Modoc, the Ponca, the government just kept sweeping populations westward.
If we step back and look at the aggregate effect, the U.S. government was fundamentally re-engineering the demographics of an entire continent.
They were playing a massive, lethal game of chess with human lives.
They took historically unrelated tribes, some of whom were ancient enemies, some who spoke completely different language families.
Some from the deep agricultural southeast, others from the Great Lakes region.
Right. And they forcefully packed them all into a single arbitrary geographic box called Indian Territory.
Which brings us back to the Osage, the Wichita, and the Comanche, the people who were already living in that box.
Right. How do you suddenly drop tens of thousands of desperate, displaced Eastern Native Americans into a territory that is already claimed and populated?
You can't do it peacefully. It created immediate, desperate conflict over resources.
Because everyone needs to survive.
Exactly. The eastern tribes arrived traumatized, but they needed hunting grounds and land to establish agriculture. As they pushed westward into Indian Territory, they encroached directly on lands claimed by the Osage and the Plains tribes.
Do the sources give a specific example of this clash?
They do. As early as 1828, the relocation of the Cherokee Old Settlers from Arkansas into Indian Territory led directly to a bloody war between the Osage Nation and those newly arrived Cherokees.
So the federal policy didn't just displace people, it manufactured a war.
It violently pitted indigenous nations against one another over rapidly shrinking resources.
It is just compounding trauma upon compounding trauma. But incredibly, despite the wars, the disease, and the displacement, these nations do what they have always done.
They adapt.
They adapt and they begin to rebuild. They establish new capitals in Oklahoma, new constitutional governments, new farms, new schools.
But just as they start to stabilize,
A massive national conflict tears the entire region apart again, the American Civil War.
the Civil War in Indian Territory is a chapter that is almost entirely omitted from standard American history classes.
It really is, yet it was absolutely devastating.
To understand it, we really have to look at the demographics of Indian Territory by 1860.
Okay, lay it out for us.
You had about 55,000 Native Americans, roughly 3,000 white residents, and critically 8,400 enslaved black people owned by members of the native tribes.
I want to pause there because I think for a lot of people listening, the idea of Native Americans owning enslaved black people is a jarring historical fact.
It is, but it ties directly back to that concept of assimilation we discussed earlier.
Right. When the 5 civilized tribes were trying to assimilate in the American South before removal, they adopted the Southern white economic model.
Which was built on the institution of chattel slavery. Wealthy tribal members established plantations, and when they were forced onto the trails of tears, they brought that institution and those enslaved people with them to Indian Territory.
So the territory is economically and politically tied to the South. Then, in 1861, the Civil War breaks out.
And Indian Territory is geographically wedged right between the Union forces in Kansas and the Confederate forces in Texas.
But here is the critical turning point. What does the United States government actually do?
They simply pack up and leave.
They just abandon them.
Completely.
Yeah.
Union forces, led by Lieutenant Colonel William H. Emery, literally abandoned their major military outposts in the territory, Fort Washita, Fort Arbuckle, and Fort Cobb.
And retreated north.
They retreated north to Kansas, leaving the tribal nations completely defenseless against the encroaching, highly motivated Texas Confederate forces.
Let's put this in perspective. Imagine you live in an apartment complex, and your landlord has spent the last 30 years harassing you, breaking into your unit, and brutally forcing you into a smaller and smaller room.
Okay, tracking.
Then the building catches on fire. The landlord locks the door from the outside and runs away, leaving you trapped with the fire. That is essentially what the Union did to these tribes.
That is a phenomenal analogy. It was viewed as a profound betrayal.
I mean, how could it not be?
From the perspective of many Native leaders, the U.S. government had systematically broken every single treaty they had ever signed, violently evicted them, and now they were abandoning them to a hostile Confederate military force.
Why on earth would they maintain loyalty to the Union?
Exactly. And into this massive power vacuum steps Albert Pike.
Who is Albert Pike?
He was a Confederate commissioner sent specifically to negotiate with the tribes, and he understood exactly what they needed.
What did he offer them?
He offered them everything the Union wouldn't. He offered formal treaties of alliance, guaranteed military protection from the South, assuming of their annuity payments that the Union had cut off.
Wow, so actual financial support too?
Yes, and he even promised them representation in the Confederate Congress in Richmond.
Did the tribes uniformly accept this? I imagine there had to be severe internal debate.
They were not a monolith by any means. Principal Chief John Ross of the Cherokee fought desperately to maintain neutrality.
Because he knew getting involved in a white man's war would just lead to destruction.
Exactly. But his position was impossible. He had no Union support, he was surrounded by Confederate forces, and a powerful pro-Confederate faction within his own tribe was ready to ally with the South.
Who was leading that faction?
A man named Stan Wadey. Eventually, recognizing the geopolitical reality, Pike managed to sign treaties with all the major tribes.
But this didn't unite the territory, did it?
Not at all. It fractured it completely.
The sources describe it as a civil war inside a civil war.
That is exactly what it was. Minority factions within the tribes who remained fiercely loyal to the Union or simply hated the Confederate factions completely opposed the alliances.
Which leads to local fighting.
Brutal, localized, neighbor against neighbor fighting. And when Union troops and loyalist Native Americans eventually reorganized and invaded Indian territory to take it back.
Which led to a strategic Union victory at the Battle of Honey Springs in 1863, right?
Yes, and that caused a massive refugee crisis. Thousands of pro-Confederate Native Americans had to flee south, becoming starving refugees in the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations.
While Loyalist refugees froze in Kansas.
It was a humanitarian disaster on all sides.
And the fighting was relentless. The dedication of some of these Native Confederate units was intense. The sources point out a truly wild fact about Stan Waddy.
Oh, this is one of those incredible historical footnotes.
Right. Confederate Brigadier General Stan Waddy, who was the Cherokee leader who opposed John Ross, was literally the absolute last Confederate general to surrender.
He surrendered in June of 1865.
That is months after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox.
Waddy waged a highly effective, deeply disruptive guerrilla insurgency. He captured Union supply trains and kept the entire territory destabilized.
Why did he keep fighting for so long?
He wasn't just fighting for the Confederacy at that point. He was fighting for what he believed was the survival of his specific faction of the Cherokee Nation.
But when the war finally ended, the political fallout was catastrophic, wasn't it?
Immensely catastrophic. The fact that these tribes had allied with the Confederacy, even out of sheer survival necessity and Union abandonment, gave the U.S. government the ultimate leverage they had been waiting for.
Which brings us to the next phase of this demographic shift, the systematic erasure of Indian territory.
Yes, this is a pivotal moment in the sources.
Because when the war ends, the U.S. government doesn't sit down and look at the nuanced context of why the tribes allied with the South.
No, they don't apologize for abandoning the forts.
They just use the Confederate alliance as a weapon to punish the tribes and take more land.
We see the federal strategy transition here from physical removal to legal and bureaucratic erasure. In 1866, the federal government forced the tribes to sign the Reconstruction treaties.
And the terms were draconian, right?
Extremely. The government essentially said, because you rebelled, your previous treaties are void. They forced the tribes to cede the entire central and western portions of Indian territory back to the federal government.
So they sliced the pie again, taking the entire middle section.
Yes, and this huge, incredibly fertile swath of land in the middle of the territory became known as the unassigned lands.
And these treaties did more than just take land, right? Sources mention railroads.
Much more. They mandated that railroads be allowed to cross Indian lands, which was the Trojan horse for massive white settlement, commerce, and timber extraction.
It just opens the floodgates.
Exactly. The treaties also legally outlawed slavery within the tribes and required them to adopt the freedmen, the formerly enslaved black people, into the tribes as citizens.
Which created incredibly complex, ongoing issues of integration and sovereignty that still resonate in tribal politics today.
It's a hugely complicated legacy.
But I want to focus on those unassigned lands in the center, because that creates the catalyst for the image we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Ah, the boomers.
Yes. In the 1870s and 80s, you have this relentless pressure from organized groups of white settlers known as the boomers.
The boomers were highly organized agitators. They looked at the unassigned lands and demanded that the federal government open them up for white homesteading.
What was their justification for that?
Their argument was incredibly cynical. They claimed that because the land was taken from the tribes as a punishment, it was now public domain.
Oh, I see.
And therefore, they argued it was their God-given right as American citizens to settle it.
Wait, let me make sure I'm getting this timeline straight. The famous 1889 land run, the one celebrated with the covered wagons, the soaring music, the pioneer spirit, was essentially just the government handing out the exact same land they had explicitly promised to Native Americans for as long as the grass grows and the rivers flow, just a few decades earlier.
That is exactly what it was. On April 20th, 1889, President Benjamin Harrison yielded to the boomer pressure and opened 2 million acres of the unassigned lands.
And that's the starting gun.
Tens of thousands of settlers lined up at the borders and literally raced in to claim a plot.
And the Sooners.
Some people, known as the Sooners, illegally sneaked over the border early to steal the best plots before the starting gun even fired.
So the land run is romanticized as the opening of an empty frontier.
But historically, it was the aggressive colonization of a space that was deliberately carved out of sovereign tribal territory.
And as the sources show, the government didn't stop at the unassigned lands. The boomers got a taste, and they wanted the rest of the territory.
They wanted all of it.
Which is where we get to two incredibly destructive pieces of legislation. The Dawes Act of 1887 and the Curtis Act of 1898.
Yes.
Because if the land run was a physical invasion, these acts sound like the ultimate bureaucratic weapons.
Bureaucratic weapon is the perfect term. The U.S. policy had fundamentally shifted again. They no longer wanted to isolate Native Americans geographically. They wanted to force total assimilation by destroying the very concept of the tribe.
How did the Dawes Act do that?
Well, the Dawes Act authorized the federal government to break up communal tribal lands. For centuries, these nations held their land in common. There was no private real estate.
Right, it belonged to the whole nation.
So the Dawes Commission was sent in to literally survey the land, draw grids over it, and force individual ownership. They assigned small, specific allotments, usually 160 acres, to individual Native American families.
Let's use an analogy to understand how devastating this is.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a tribal nation is like a successful, employee-owned corporation where everyone shares the profits in the land. The Dawes Act is like a hostile corporate takeover. The government comes in, forces every single employee to take one single share of stock, dissolves the board of directors, and says, you're all just independent contractors now.
That's a great way to explain it.
It isolates everyone so their collective power is entirely destroyed. And let me guess, after everyone got their 160 acres, there was a lot of leftover land.
Your analogy is spot on, and you hit on the exact mathematical mechanism of the theft. By breaking the land down into individual 160-acre plots, the government generated millions of acres of surplus land.
Which they just took.
That surplus was immediately opened up to white settlement and corporate purchase. The Dawes Act was a mathematically designed system to legally strip the tribes of their land base while pretending to turn them into yeoman farmers.
And then the Curtis Act.
The Curtis Act of 1898 was the final nail in the coffin. It officially abolished tribal courts, dismantled tribal governments, and brought all of Indian Territory under federal law.
I really want to highlight something specific from our sources here, because it shows how deeply corrupt this process was on the ground. There is a mention of a landmark historian named Angie DeBow and her 1940 book, And Still the Waters Run.
Yes, her work is absolutely foundational.
The sources say she detailed the massive corruption, moral depravity, and betrayal orchestrated by the Dawes Commission. What did she actually uncover?
DeBow dug into the local courthouse records and proved that the allotment process wasn't just a misguided, paternalistic, philanthropic effort. It was a massive criminal enterprise, sanctioned by the state.
How were they stealing it specifically?
She documented how white lawyers, judges, and businessmen colluded to declare Native adults incompetent so they could be appointed as their legal guardians.
Oh my God.
They would then legally siphon off the resources, the timber, and eventually the massive oil wealth found on those individual allotments.
This is literally a legal mafia.
Worse, there were cases of Native children being assigned land only to mysteriously die, allowing their white guardians to inherit the oil rights. It was systemic, legalized robbery designed to ensure the territory could eventually become a white-dominated state.
That is sickening. But here is a part of the story that I had literally never heard of before reading these sources.
The Sequoia Convention.
Yes. The tribes did not just roll over. They fought back politically, using the government's own system. In 1905, they organized the Sequoia Constitutional Convention.
It is one of the greatest what-ifs of American history.
Set the scene for us.
Well, the leaders of the 5 civilized tribes saw the Curtis Act dismantling their governments. They realized Indian Territory was about to be swallowed up completely.
So what did they do?
They decided to try and enter the United States on their own terms. Leaders from all 5 nations met in Muskogee. They drafted a highly progressive, fully formed state constitution.
They mapped out counties, they established a Bill of Rights.
And they formally proposed the creation of the state of Sequoia.
Let me make sure I'm understanding this. It would have been a U.S. state with a Native American majority population, governed by Native leaders, entirely separate from the white-dominated Oklahoma Territory next door.
That was exactly the proposal.
And the sources say the residents of Indian Territory overwhelmingly voted to approve this constitution.
They approved it by a massive margin. It was wildly popular.
But statehood requires approval from Washington.
Yes, it requires approval from the U.S. Congress and the president. And President Theodore Roosevelt, along with a Congress deeply resistant to the idea of a native-controlled state wielding power in Washington, rejected it
So
entirely.
they wouldn't even consider it.
They refused to even entertain the idea. Instead, they forced Indian Territory to merge with the Oklahoma Territory to the west. And in 1907, those two halves were combined to create the single state of Oklahoma.
That feels like the ultimate final erasure.
Hmm.
I mean, they went from flourishing sovereign nations at Spiro Mounds to a designated holding zone, to individual surveyed plots, to having their proposed state rejected, to being completely absorbed and legally dissolved by the state of Oklahoma.
That was certainly the federal government's intent, and if the story ended in 1907, it would be nothing but a tragedy of erasure.
But history doesn't stop.
Exactly. If you look at the trajectory of the 20th century, you realize that despite this massive, systemic attempt to destroy tribal sovereignty and force assimilation, the Native American spirit in Oklahoma did not vanish.
The canvas wasn't wiped clean.
No, the nations merely went dormant, adapting and surviving until they could surge back.
Which brings us to the modern era and the incredible resurgence of Native voices. We jump forward in our sources to the 1960s and 70s.
A fascinating time period.
The entire country is going through a massive civil rights awakening, protesting the Vietnam War, fighting for voting rights, and Native Americans in Oklahoma are right at the forefront of what becomes known as the Red Power movement.
This era is vital because it marks the explicit pivot from mere survival back to demanding self-determination. The activists of the 70s weren't just asking politely anymore.
They were taking direct action.
A great example detailed in our sources is the 1972 action by the American Indian Movement, commonly known as AIM. About 40 to 50 members marched into the state office and literally took over the office of the Indian Education Director, Overton James.
A literal occupation of the office. What was the specific mechanism they were protesting?
They were outraged by the misuse of funds from the Johnson-O'Malley Act.
Let me explain how that worked for everyone listening. This was federal money specifically allocated to support Native American students in public schools, paying for things like supplies, tutoring, and lunches.
Right. But the activists, led by Regional AIM Coordinator Carter Camp, argued that the state and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, were hoarding the money, mismanaging it, and completely ignoring any input from Native parents on how it should be spent.
So they occupied the office and demand control over their own education funds. Did it actually work? Did the BIA listen?
It worked remarkably well. By forcing a highly visible confrontation, Carter Camp and AIM forced the BIA's hand.
What did the government concede?
The federal government actually froze the Johnson-O'Malley funds and agreed to negotiate. The activists won the right to establish parent committees, ensuring direct Native input into how those education finances were utilized.
It proved that direct action could force the massive federal bureaucracy to yield.
Yes, and AIM kept pushing. The sources mention them protesting at the Fort Hill Indian School over administrative neglect and terrible living conditions.
But AIM wasn't the only group moving the needle. The sources also highlight the creation of the National Indian Youth Council, or the NIYC, which was co-founded by a brilliant Oklahoman named Clyde Warrior.
Clyde Warrior is a legendary figure in modern Native activism. He was an incredibly charismatic orator who sparked decades of grassroots organizing.
What is crucial to understand about the NIYC and leaders like Warrior is the distinction in their goals, right? They were not just fighting for civil rights.
Right, and that's a profound difference in this context.
Because civil rights sounds like the ultimate goal to most people. Break that down for us.
Civil rights essentially means treat me equally within your established system. Sovereignty means recognize my right to govern my own system. Warrior and the NIYC wanted the nationhood that was stolen from them by the Curtis Act and Oklahoma Statehood to be legally recognized and restored. They wanted the right to self-determination, not just integration.
That is a brilliant distinction. Sovereignty is saying we are a nation, not just a minority demographic.
Exactly.
And you see the power of that grassroots fight for sovereignty perfectly illustrated in the Choctaw Youth Movement. According to the sources, in the 1970s, the federal government was utilizing a policy known as termination. They were actively trying to legally dissolve the Choctaw Nation entirely.
The termination era was the government's final attempt to wash its hands of treaty obligations. There was a specific bill known as Belvin's Law, named, incredibly, after the principal chief of the Choctaw, Harry J.W. Belvin.
Wait, the chief of the tribe supported the termination bill?
He did, initially, because he believed assimilation was inevitable and this was the best way to manage it. This law was set to finalize the total dissolution of the tribe's assets and government.
So an activist named Charles E. Brown steps up. He starts organizing urban Choctaw youth. And they don't do this with violence. They do it with incredible grassroots organizing.
They literally went door to door.
They printed and mailed newsletters across the country that explicitly criticized Chief Belvin and broke down the legal mechanisms of the law. They explained exactly how it would strip the Choctaw people of their remaining legacy and land control.
It was the power of the press and collective education. Those newsletters created a sudden, unified realization among the Choctaw people, many of whom had been relocated to cities far away from Oklahoma.
What was the result?
Brown and the youth movement launched a massive petition drive. They intensely lobbied Congress, and they successfully fought off the termination bill.
That's amazing.
They deposed the leadership that supported it, and they kept their sovereign nation legally alive.
And that specific grassroots activism laid the bedrock for the reality of Oklahoma today. If you drive through Oklahoma now, from the late 20th century to the present day, you see a massive, undeniable rise in the assertion of tribal sovereignty.
You really do.
You see tribal nations issuing their own vehicle license plates. You see them operating massive, state-of-the-art healthcare systems. They run major economic enterprises, smoke shops, enormous casino resorts, and corporate tech entities that are major drivers of the entire state's economy.
They are political and economic powerhouses today, and it is a testament to an endurance that a century of targeted federal policy could not break.
It's just a wildly incredible timeline. From the Spurrow Mounds to the Trail of Tears to total legal dissolution back to powerful, modern political entities.
Because, you see, the Indian Removal Act was cynically designed to clear land in the East. But what it inadvertently did was create a dense, complex, and politically brilliant concentration of Native nations in the West.
Their subsequent fight for survival, their ability to adapt to catastrophic betrayal, and their modern economic resurgence is the actual defining DNA of the state of Oklahoma. So to bring it all together for you listening, Oklahoma's history is not a simple pioneer story. It is fundamentally a story of indigenous displacement, profound bureaucratic betrayal, and unyielding survival.
It definitely is.
The covered wagons and the land runs you pictured at the beginning, those are just the very tip of a much deeper, much older iceberg.
I would like to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've uncovered today. Think about the concept of a border.
Okay.
When you look at a map of Oklahoma today, you see rigid, perfectly drawn state and county lines. But underneath that modern map are the invisible overlapping geographies of ancient hunting grounds.
The physical scars of forced exile routes.
And the hard-won, incredibly complex boundaries of modern tribal sovereignty. What does it actually mean to be a citizen of a state that was built directly on top of a broken promise?
That's a powerful question.
And how does knowing the precise mechanics of that history change the way you look at the ground beneath your own feet today?
That is exactly what we want you to take away from this. The map is never the whole territory. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We highly encourage you to look into these sources, read up on the history of the nations whose land you live on, and keep exploring. There is always more beneath the surface.